Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting our students to learn what we teach. And I am Rob Alvarez. I'm the founder of Professor Game and professor of gamification and games-based solutions at IE Business School, EFMD, EBS University, and many other places around the world. And if this content is for you, then please go ahead and subscribe to our email list for free at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey, engagers, and welcome to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we have with us Javier. But Javier, we need to know, are you prepared to engage?
I am prepared to engage, of course, always.
Fantastic. And Javier Velasquez is here because he is the co-founder of Azahar Juegos and Free-to-Play. There are companies that focus on the design and research around the use of playful paradigms in serious context. He has 11 years of experience working on gamification projects and has collaborated on educational projects with institutions in Colombia, such as Universidad Los Andes, Sergio Arboleda, Rosario, Uniminuto, and with companies such as Bancolombia, Compensar, Grupo Bolivar, among others. He's also the designer of the BEM Framework for systemic and meaningful gamification and the recipient of 2 awards from tech magazine Gamicon 2019 for gamification projects in virtual learning. So many exciting things going on in your world, Javier. Is there anything that you would like to mention before we continue?
That I love gaming. I love playing games. I love analyzing games. This is my life. For the past 11 years, I've been working hard on trying to understand how to bring this to the real world. And it's been quite a journey with a lot of unexpected things happening on the way. But from each project, I think I have learned a lot, and I really love seeing how games can actually have a real impact in the real world. I was like a game designer first, and using them just for commercial purposes. I design board games, but having the possibility to impact the real world using the knowledge I have as a game designer has been quite an experience.
Certainly sounds like it. So fantastic to have you here, Javier. We like to get to know our guests a little bit more. We'd like to understand a little bit, what does your life look like? So can you run us through a day, a week, or a month in your life, in the regular or not so regular things that you are usually doing?
Sure thing. So my main thing in terms of my work life, I work in a lot of projects, right? What I do is people hire me to try to help them build projects with gamification from zero, mainly, or do consultations for projects that already are ongoing and that they already exist and they want to know my professional view. A big part of my life is being a project manager and understanding how to move all the pieces along so gamification projects can happen. Right now, I'm moving more towards education itself. For example, one of the things I do a lot is working with universities to teach teachers skills around gamification. So I think that's more impactful in many ways, and I really love doing that. So I'm trying to move along my life more into that direction. And in my non-work life, my personal life, I am married. I love my wife. She loves board games, and that's something awesome to share with her. She's the graphic designer of our company, so we work together, and we love playing games. Mainly board games, but also a lot of video games. Right now, I'm really hooked with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example. And I was really hooked with Horizon Dawn. And that's my life. My idle life is about playing games, and my work life is about designing games. So it's all very related.
Good. Sounds like you're very aligned in that sense. So talking about alignment, how about we go for a time where there was not really that much alignment? We want to go for a story of fail or first attempt in learning, Javier.
Sure.
Can you tell us such a story, maybe your favorite fail, if you would like to go for that?
Okay, so I think my first, 4 years working in gamification are failure stories. Because, of course, the first models of gamification were built around this more behavioral approach, like this Skinner approach. And I was going for badges and points and leaderboards. And I saw those projects failed a lot. They worked like for, I don't know, maybe 2 months, and then they crashed. And like trying to keep motivation ongoing just by using reward systems was really, really hard. I think I was fortunate that I was a teacher before entering into gamification space. I work as a teacher in high schools, in universities here in Colombia, and I love teaching. So when I started working on gamification for learning, things started working better because I think I had a previous background that worked for me. But still, there were a lot of projects where people would engage. For example, I remember one class that I tried to gamify for myself. And it was awful because I made it so complex and so complicated that my poor students couldn't keep along with all the rules and things that I was building into the course. So there was a lot of learning there. But yeah, I think I have maybe 4 years of failures in my resume, just trying to figure out how to make gamification work from what I understood from the literature in the time. So there's a lot of things that failed in that time.
Sounds amazing. And actually, Javier, how about we go for one of those times, one of those stories where, as you were saying, you were especially in that learning world or wherever you want to guide us, right? Can you share a moment or a few moments of that? How it went? What failed? What would you have done perhaps differently if you had the time to do it once again? We want to be there with you. We want to live that story over again.
Sure thing. My first project was my first failure. It was a project for a company called HD Group. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a consultant for human resource departments. And it was about motivation, actually. It was a company that tried to develop human talent. And we started working on gamification. And the whole idea behind the system was that people would give information in exchange for level ups and badges and points and rewards and all this stuff. And it was like 6 months into the making of the first MVP. And when we tested, the only people playing the game were the designers of the game. And because they had to, because there were a lot of forms, and it was the things that people were doing in the app were busy work. And it was like this metaphor of chocolate over broccoli. It was really a lot of broccoli. The main activities people were doing were awful. They were really boring. And we were just giving them points for doing them. So they would engage like 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and they would stop playing altogether. And we thought it was about dosification. For example, in that time, people talked a lot about how we should dosify the gameplay like in mobile games. So the people would play just 5 minutes at a time every day, and people wouldn't come for the second day. Never. They would never come for the second day after playing the first 10 minutes of the game. So it was a game without game, for example. And it was a big failure. It didn't pick up. It never worked. And I learned there the hard way that I couldn't improve a project just by using these reward systems, that there was a lot more behind the gamification project than just rewarding people for doing busy work, for example.
Interesting. And again, if you were to do this once again, like if this were to happen nowadays, do you have any advice for your past self or for somebody who's actually doing this for the first time? What would you tell them if you had that opportunity? What would be, again, your advice, perhaps? Yeah.
Okay. First, the first thing that I started doing and that started working for me was when I shifted from reward-based designs towards feedback-based designs. So I started understanding that it wasn't mainly about trying to create reward cycles to create engagement, but to give great feedback to keep people motivated and create emotional feedback that would make people want to keep working on the project. So I started working on feedback systems really, really early. I say really early, that's like 2015, maybe like 4 years again after beginning working with gamification. But when I shifted toward feedback systems more than reward systems, things improved a lot, even when I was gamifying busy work. So busy work was hard, but the feedback systems were not about just progression and points and acquiring things, but around understanding my mood, for example, in the game, and how a simple feedback system could improve the way I experience the results of my system. And also, one of the big things that I would do different in that project is giving more information to the player in terms of the results of what they were doing, because it was like a form, like imagine Google Forms, where you would just fill this form and send it away, but you would not have any feedback around what happened with that form. Like when you fill a form for a bank, you just fill it and the feedback is really limited. So one of the things I have changed in terms of that is let's create dashboards so you know your answers, how they compute into the whole data of whatever we are doing, giving people, for example, feedback around how other people are responding the same questions, and that kind of things create more engagement. And again, there are simple tricks to create engagement around these kind of things. And also, I think my best suggestion would be to manage expectations, like understanding that if we're going to make people do busy work, let's not expect them to be doing them for, I don't know, 4 months or something like that. Let's try to get the more value possible for a task that we know will have extinction of behavior, for example. So let's try to make it the best possible experience, maybe in a limited time, and don't go for the infinite game, but use that time in the best possible way to get the more data that you need in the project, for example. That kind of things. Managing expectations would be a big thing right now, a suggestion for my past self. I thought
Fantastic.
gamification would solve everything when I began with gamification. I thought it would be a silver bullet. So it was about understanding that it was harder to do than I thought.
Sounds great. Sounds great. And Javier, actually, let's take a shift from that. That was a project that didn't work out well, at least initially for you. How about we go for one which actually was a big success, something, a proud moment, something you want to share with us? And here, instead of the lessons learned from the bad things, how about we look into the success factors or the positive lessons you got from such a project?
Okay, like picking one project can be hard. I don't want to go to the project that I showcase in Gamicon because I think there's information out there for that project. So maybe if you're hearing, you can check Cash Inc. in Gamicon, and there's like a whole case study for that project that I really loved and that was a big success. But if I had to tell maybe one story here, for example, we work on a certification program. It was about a university needed to get certified by the government, and they were trying to train students and teachers around all the things they needed to know about the university to answer the questions that the government would make to a random sample of the people to see if the university would be certified. And we created a really interesting game that was a social experience, in terms that it's a university that have a lot of, it's around it's in every place in Colombia. It's in rural areas, and it's really spread out around Colombia. So we created like this game where each institution within the university would be like a portal, and they had to answer questions to activate those portals and keep them open. But if they were open, people would be able to attack the portals of the other, like the other places in the university. And it was really interesting to see how this a small factor of competition drove people to play for over 2 months, learning about the university in several aspects of the university, and seeing how the university was certified with the best grade possible by the government, and people were really engaged with multiple types of players. It was a really cool experience, and the main thing we did was trying to make learning a social experience. It was actually really a really fun project, for example. So that would be one I remember right now.
Fantastic story. And we love to hear also the success of our guests, the good stuff that has happened. And again, you were saying, I think it was 11 years, so we started around the same time in this world. Along all the experience that you've had, I'm guessing that you have sort of a way of doing things, a process, name it as you will. You also have the BEM framework. I don't know if it's that you want to go for, but we would like to get, a gist, an introduction to what does actually creating these experiences look like for you. If you were to create a new one starting right now, what would be the steps, the process, whatever you want to go for?
Sure thing. So yeah, I think the answer would be I would go for my BEM framework. So one of the things I like to say about gamification is that I believe gamification is more a design discipline than a methodology, in terms that I believe you need to learn a lot about a lot of things to actually improve your design skills, which means that you don't need a framework to actually build great designs, but having a framework is a way of organizing all these like gigantic set of data and information around motivation and about game design and around everything that there is. So what I do in my process is The BM methodology wants to make meaningful gamification projects. That's the main thing. And doing meaningful gamification projects for me means that my players should leave the system better than how they entered the system when they started playing the game. I want them to learn, and I want them to be transformed by in some way or some other way. And the first step into doing that is actually working on 7 core drivers. So many gamification frameworks work from this perspective of using drivers as a main of organizing information. I do it as well. I work with 7 drivers that are like just I pick them from theories, from other theories like self-determination theories and all the theories that are usually found in motivation. I included hedonism, which I studied literature. So for me, the aesthetic appeal in terms of a motivational driver is really important, which is something that I don't see in a lot of the other frameworks. And I get these 7 drivers. And my idea behind this is that I want to be able to create a game that would invite as many people as possible into the game. And that means trying to create mechanics for different styles of players within the game. So it's not about choosing one driver or making one game about 1 or 2 drivers, but trying to be holistic in the process of understanding why people would engage with the material or with the behaviors or with the tasks that we are inviting them to do, by understanding why they would do them. And understanding drivers is about understanding goals, which is the second part of the process. Is if I understand which are the drivers and why people would or could be driven into any kind of gamified system, then I need to build great goals for them. Because game designers, what we do and what we do better than other people is that we are great at building interesting goals. So any board game starts with a goal. Every video game has multiple goals. And the idea behind the BM framework is that people will engage more when there are more goals within the system. So many of those goals are undeclared. If you play Mario Brothers, one goal can be to pick 100 coins to just gain one level to level up, or you can just try to figure out which pipes take you to new discoveries and new secret levels. And all these micro goals are what make games interesting. Of course, in mobile games, you have all these dashboards with all your missions and all your challenges and everything that you have to do within the game. But the micro goals, the bigger goals, and the narrative goals, for example, understanding that when you play Mario Brothers, you remember first what is the narrative mission of the game, like to save the princess, for example. But then the other goals within the system are the ones that keep you really engaged. And having more goals increases the odds of you trying one of them out. And that many of these goals are secondary, are optional. That's one of the things behind the BM, is making a lot of optional secondary missions, for example, so people can choose with which they want to engage with. And from there, I want to create a better performance within the game, that the players will try to do better things because they choose the goals. And when you choose things, the motivation is more intrinsic. From there, I pass to the third step, and it's about creating feedback rules and feedback systems. It's understanding how games create feedback cycles, feedback rules, how everything is about how feedback is about creating discriminatory signals, that you can understand which feedback element responds to which consequence. And you can learn from that really well if you have this clear language of feedback rules, where you know that each time you, grab a coin in Mario Bros, the same sounds in your head. In this moment, you should be hearing it because you should be remembering how a coin sounds in your head for Mario Brothers, because it's a great feedback design. It has a great feedback design. Understanding that feedback comes from both visual and auditory output signals, and how you process them, and you need that feedback to be consistent, and understanding that not only to be consistent, but also to be engageful with the feedback, that the feedback not only provides information about how you are in the game, but also provides information about how you should feel in the game. So I said as an example, it's different if I say, hey, you won 2 points, to say, hey, you won 2 points. Dun, dun. It's different in terms of the emotional level in the way I'm designing the feedback, and understanding this will mean also understanding your interfaces, knowing how you are going to create interfaces for your gamification project. They can be analog, they can be cards, they can be dice, or they can be, of course, screens with virtual elements and virtual reality, whatever you choose. But understanding that the interfaces must respond to the needs of the feedback elements that you need to require. One example I give, for example, is online commerce. If you go to an online place, an online commerce, the feedback systems that they employ in Amazon or in any regular business in terms of online commerce is really limited to your transactional feedback. It's like, okay, purchase successful, but they don't tell you how to feel about your purchase being successful. Only a few people are able to create great feedback systems for something like shopping online. People think, for example, in the virtual world as engineers, as they need to know, but they don't understand the emotional aspect behind designing great feedback systems. And there I come to the last step, or one of the last steps, but the final big step is understanding cycles. Like games are built around cycles, like engagement loops, feedback loops, learning loops, farming loops, working loops. There are a lot of loops that are created within the game to create this engagement process around doing repetitive work, but making that repetitive work novel each time you're doing the same thing. Like when you're playing a board game, each time you get a turn, you can do the same actions, but each time the board changed, so the actions that you have to plan are different in your mind. The actions are the same. Maybe you have to do one of three things in the game, but each round, these three things you have to evaluate them differently because the game board changed, and that means you're still engaged with the game because the problem is still fresh. Even though you don't have a lot of choices, still the problems are fresh and the decisions are fresh. So the last step is about creating these loops and these decision cycles. And from there, of course, testing a lot. You cannot be sure how your game will work unless you test it and get feedback and iterate and do a lot of this obvious design work, but that in the corporate world, for example, they don't iterate enough as I would like as a game designer, for example. So that's a really important step for me. And it's usually the thing that clients say, okay, we'll give it like 3 weeks at the end of the project to test. No, please. Testing is the most important part of the project. So that's really a big part before launching the project to the real world. Something like that would be like the key methodological steps of the BEM framework.
These are key, and it's also really difficult to convince people.
Yeah, it's really difficult.
They are, for sure. So, Javier, we've been talking about many things on the podcast. You've had a lot of experience. So is there something, not a silver bullet, but a best practice, something that you say, if you do this, your project is at least going to be a little bit better?
Sure. I believe that one of the main things that I do to try to make sure that my projects are a little bit better is understanding. It's understanding the premise that motivation is not an easy thing to design. And this might seem counterintuitive, but understanding that motivation cannot be reduced to one single element. It's like, okay, we can understand that motivation is about energy, perseverance, direction. There's a lot of theories around how to measure motivation, what motivates people. But when you start, for example, I love one YouTube channel from someone that's called Mark. I forgot his last name right now, but it's the Game Maker's Toolkits, the name of the channel. And I love this guy because he analyzes a lot of games. And when you watch him analyze games, one of the main things that come around a lot when you're trying to understand how a game works is understanding that design choices can affect different people in different ways, to a point where one person might love a design choice and another person might hate it. It's about absolute opposite emotions around the same mechanic. And the thing I try to do to make sure my gamification projects work better is in trying to understand that complexity in the human nature, that we evolved as humans to be diverse, not to be standardized. Like we're not built to be the same, to think the same. We built to make choices, not to take the choices out of the table. For example, I try to rely as little as possible in behavioral economics, because behavioral economics tend to take choice away from people. And as a game designer, I like to give choice. Like if you're playing Pokemon, I want you to choose between 3 Pokemons that all are as good as the other. Like Pokemon, sorry, the plural form is Pokemon. So I digress. Want to make sure that people will love all the choices, and you can choose one and have a great experience, and you don't have to like have this conformity around people doing the same things. So when I start working with the mindset of understanding this kind of complexity, my projects work better because I'm not like focusing in one niche, in one type of user persona or learner persona, or however you want to call it. I'm trying to figure out the interactions of humanity as a complex system as a whole. And I think that's a great way to start. It's not the easiest way to start, but it's a great way to get better results.
Sounds amazing. Sounds amazing. And getting into what has been your experience here, maybe when you're answering the questions, or maybe because you've heard it before, you would say, I'd really like to hear this or that person answering those questions. So, is there a future guest that you would love to hear on Professor Game?
A featured guest that I would love to hear in Professor Game. One of the people I think are absolutely brilliant in this like gamification ecosystem is David Chandras. I think you have heard him in Gamicon, maybe.
Yes,
He has
yes.
he has a background in neuroscience that's impressive. He has an absolute understanding on how the brain works and how game activates brain functions. It's absolutely delightful to hear him. So that would be a great guest, I think. I don't know. There's a lot of great people right now in gamification. When I started, it was hard to find people. Now it's hard to cherry pick. But yeah, I think David Chandras would be a great fit for a podcast. I think there's a lot to pick out of from his brain.
Absolutely, Javier. David Chandras is not just a great potential guest. He has been a guest on Professor Game. Not once, but twice. He is absolutely fantastic. I couldn't agree more. And I understand. I always tell my guests, like, you can name somebody who's been here. We are over 300 episodes now. So reading through every single one, if you haven't been there from mid start or so, it is a tough task. I can perfectly
Sure.
understand that. But Javier, on the recommendation side, is there a book that you would recommend the engagers to read?
I love one author. He has a book. It's called A Recipe for Meaningful Gamification. It's Scott Nicholson. I love his work, and I think it's not one of the big names out there. I knew Scott Wickle. I knew not personally, but I got to know Scott Nicholson because he was a board game reviewer first, and then he got into studying motivation and psychology and started working on gamification. I think it's one of the best first frameworks of gamification I ever read about, and he has some TED Talks, so I would recommend him as an author. It's an amazing author. He has some great in Google Scholar. You can read some of his academic publications around meaningful gamification, and it's absolutely awesome. I love his work.
Sounds like an interesting one. And if he is kind of a speaker, maybe we can also invite him
Okay,
into
yeah,
the
that would have
podcast.
been my recommendation because he's lesser known, and he's more in the
Totally.
academic circles, but he has some really clever ideas around gamification. It's really interesting.
Amazing. Amazing. Keeping up with the recommendations, but now instead of recommending things in other people, let's talk about you, Javier. What would you say is your superpower? That thing that you do better, at least than most other people. Again, it doesn't have to be totally exclusive.
Okay, I think one of my superpowers within this context, at least, is I have a great analytical view around what games do. I understand. I have like this clockwork vision around how a game works, why it works, and I try to understand how this can be taken outside of the context of the game and bring it to the real world. And that's why, for example, if you read my LinkedIn articles, they're about trying to understand the things that people don't talk about in gamification, because gamification usually tends to be like, let's keep it superficial so everyone can understand. I like to go to deeper levels. Like, for example, right now I'm trying to understand how game algorithms, or how the way game designers create algorithms that could improve algorithms that are used, for example, in YouTube or in social media. For example, one idea that I give you is I think algorithms in games are about giving some kind of agency to the player, while algorithms in digital technologies is about trying to predict what the player or the user will want. And if you could give more choice to the player, like, for example, if you have your Netflix account and you could organize a little bit better, like how Spotify lets you create playlists, but in Netflix, how you could improve your experience of giving information to the algorithm so it can be better tailored to you, and not just expect that it can learn from what you watch. It's not just pushing information. I think game designers could actually teach a lot these algorithm designers how to improve their work. So I think that's a deep understanding that I want to bring to the world. and share it. I like to write about these things. I like to share this information, and I try to keep it as appealing as possible. So I think that might be my superpower.
Sounds like it for sure. So, Javier, we're getting to the end of the episode, but we have a difficult question still in here. What would you say is your favorite game?
It's so difficult. It's really difficult when you are the kind of player that I am, because my way of playing is not about getting in love with one game, but about trying to pick as many games as possible and try to figure out what is great from each game. So, for example, I buy board games and I play them once, twice, and then I'm buying the next board game. So I think there are, for example, in board games right now, I can say I love the design of Bitoku, for example. I love that game. That's one I would recommend a lot. In terms of video games, as I told you, I have been really engaged with Horizon Dawn. I played Horizon Dawn the last year. I think my PlayStation account was telling me to play other things, please. So I was really engaged with that game. So I would recommend that game a lot to people. But there are simpler games that I also love. For example, Take Six. Take Six is a classical German card game that it's absolutely beautiful in its design. It's really simple, but it's absolutely awesome. So I would never say I have a favorite game. It's just too hard for me. But I could recommend some games for you guys if I can do that.
You should be able to pick at least one, but we'll let it pass. This time, the engagers will stay with those recommendations from Javier. Javier, before we let you go, is there anything else you want to say to the engagers? Let us know where we can find out more about you, and then we will say it's game over.
Perfect. So you can find me mainly through LinkedIn. That's like the main social media I use. Not as active as I used to be. I wish to be more active in the future, but that's like the way to engage with me mainly. I don't know. For engagers, I would say just do your best, design, iterate, test, and learn from your designs. That's the most important thing that you need to do, is understanding that you learn from feedback. That's we, as gamification designers, we love to talk about feedback. So be eager to receive feedback from your designs, good and bad feedback, especially bad feedback. You learn from more from your losses. Of course, there are places where you can lose more safely than others, but it's really important to learn from the things that didn't work to improve your craft. That's the main thing here. And again, just try to find information about game design, not just the basic information that you might find around gamification and motivation. Trying to learn about game design it's like the tip of the iceberg of gamification. And if you go deeper and deeper, you start finding that game designers have to deal with really complex problems, and they find really creative ways of solving them, that if we could bring that creativity to real life, it would be awesome. But you need to understand how those problems work and how they solve them. So that would be my last minute invitation. Just not only play games, but try to read about game design, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating when you go down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely is. Totally. I have to vouch for that recommendation for sure. Javier, thank you very much for investing this time with this group of engagers on this podcast on Professor Game, sharing your knowledge, your understanding, your experience, good and bad for sure.
Yeah.
It's where we learn the most, as you were saying, bad feedback as well. However, Javier, engagers, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And I'd like to ask you a very quick question. How are you listening to this episode of the podcast? If you are using any podcasting app, anything from Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, I don't know, any app that you could be using out there, there's plenty of them, and we are on all of those apps. If you are doing that, have you clicked on that follow or that subscribe button? Have you rated us? Have you rated this podcast? If you haven't gone ahead and do that, please do so. This is a great way so that we can reach more engagers like you to achieve this mission of making engagement, retention, and learning amazing using game-inspired and gamification solutions. If you want the instructions, we created a quick one on professorgame.com/iTunes. And it's iTunes because that's the first one that we created. There's a couple more in there. And as always, as we like to remind you, please, before you go on and do your next thing, please remember to hit that subscribe or that follow button using that favorite podcast app. And of course, listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.